Good evening. We're going to pick up in Acts chapter 21. No, I'm sorry, 20. Toward the middle part of chapter 20, we left off at Paul's address to the Ephesian elders. I'm going to say something that you're not going to hear me say a whole lot. In fact, I hate to say it, but I've almost got to, just to be sure we cover as much as we possibly can. I'm going to hold off on any. I've always loved comments in our adult class, and that's why I say you'll almost never hear me say this, because it's so hard sometimes to get good discussion in the adult class in the auditorium. Sometimes people tend to be more quiet. I guess that maybe is a course of habit, because we tend to listen to sermons. But anyways, I love the discussion. Tonight, I'm going to hold off until the end, and hopefully we'll have just a minute or two at the end to if there are questions or comments, because I want to try to cover a little bit more tonight, because we are getting dangerously close to ending the quarter and not being done with the book of Acts, and I don't want that to be the case if at all possible. So again, let's just jump right in. We're going to begin at chapter 20, verse 17. From Miletus, he, Paul, sent to Ephesus and called the elders of the church. They are coming to him. He doesn't have the time to go to Ephesus. We talked about that last time. So he's going to send for them. They're going to come to him, and he's going to have this conversation with them, this discourse, as some people put it. It's you could call it a sermon, you could call it a speech, discourse. It's all really synonymous in this context. It's something like 30 miles or so from Ephesus to Miletus. So they travel a decent little bit to come and meet with Paul. He's going to talk to them. This, by the way, is the only recorded sermon in the book of Acts addressed only to Christians. You see a lot of sermons in the book of Acts addressed to Agrippa, Felix. You see to the Jews on the day of Pentecost. But this is the only time where you have a sermon that is addressed just to Christians. Of course, he's speaking to elders, shepherds of the flock. Paul says in verse 18, he'd been with them 3 years, and he had worked during that time. Look at verse, let me find it, 31. Watch and remember by the space of 3 years, I cease not to warn everyone night and day with tears. Verse 34, yea, ye yourselves know that these hands have ministered unto my necessities and to them that were with me. Sometimes he was supported by brethren, but he also worked in his secular job, which was what? Tent making. He says, look, you know I'm not lazy. I'm not slothful. I've been diligent. I've been among you. You know I'm striving to do everything I can to help you. In fact, he says in verse 20, he kept back nothing that was profitable. Profitable being the key word there. He didn't keep back anything profitable. Verse 19, he's going to talk about he served the Lord with all humility of mind and with many tears and temptations. That's not the best word there. Sometimes we see this in the King James, this word temptations, and what it's talking about is trials. And that's what he's talking about here. He says, count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations, James 1:2. James is not saying celebrate when you're tempted to sin. That's obviously not what he's saying. But he's saying when you fall into trials, you can rejoice knowing that you can gain a benefit from it. Not because you enjoy the trial. And we talked about that Sunday night. But here he's talking about trials which befell me by the lying in wait of the Jews. The prophets that have come to Paul have told him bad things are waiting for him. You remember Agabus came and bound. He took Paul's own girdle, bound his hands with it, and said, the Holy Spirit has said that the Jews in Jerusalem, they're going to bind the hands of the owner of this girdle. And the brethren try to get Paul not to go, and finally they give up and they say, the will of the Lord be done. So, sorry, I've been studying ahead for tonight. That's in chapter 21. Spoiler alert. That's coming. I was thinking that had already happened for a second there. Agabus is going to come to Paul, and he's going to bind his hands with his own girdle and say the owner of this girdle, the Holy Spirit says, they're going to bind his hands in Jerusalem. It seems, and I don't think I can say this with 100% certainty, it seems Paul thinks he's going to die in Jerusalem. And when you have Paul, other apostles, even prophets going back to Old Testament times, they were inspired, and we've talked before, inspiration was not a 24/7 thing, but it also was not omniscience. There are things that they didn't know, and in fact, I've got a reference here. We won't go read it. We just don't have time. But 2 Kings chapter 4, verses, I've got down 18 through 27. Really, there's a larger context there, but just you might want to just kind of make a mental note or jot it down. 2 Kings chapter 4, there's the instance where I am going to have to go cheap because I'm going to say Elijah or Elisha, and I'm not going to have it right. I think 2 Kings would be Elisha. It is Elisha. Okay, that's what I was thinking. Elisha has asked this woman, ask God for what you want. She's been so kind to the prophet of the Lord. God grants her a son. One day the son gets sick. He dies. She goes after Elisha, and Gehazi says, settle down. She's, we would say, all in a tizzy, and he basically, Gehazi is kind of saying, settle down. What is going on? And Elisha says, no. Let her come in and tell me what's going on. Something is wrong. But in verse 27, he says a key phrase there, and the Lord hath hid it from me. He says, I don't know what's going on, Gehazi. I need to hear her story. So inspiration was not omniscience, and it also was not a 24/7 thing. You see this sometimes in instances like this. It seems Paul thought, I'm going to Jerusalem and I'm going to die there. Verse 26, getting back to Acts chapter 20. Paul says, I take you to record this day, I'm pure from the blood of all men. Seems to be a throwback to Ezekiel chapter 3, where God talks to Ezekiel about being a watchman to the children of Israel. If you warn the wicked and he doesn't turn from his wicked ways, he says, well, you've saved your own soul. But if you don't warn him and he continues in his wicked ways, he's going to die for his sin, but his blood will also be on your hands because you didn't warn him and try to turn him away from that path. So seems to be a reference back to that passage. Again, here's an instance where you realize, we realize it in secular matters. When a physician, a doctor, a surgeon especially, goes in to do surgery, especially something extremely critical like heart surgery, brain surgery, we realize in that situation how critical his job is. He's got that person's life literally in his or her hands. I was talking to some brethren yesterday about a preacher I've known since I was a boy, and he had a massive tumor, and it had actually grown growth out, and it was just a bad situation, and it was intertwined with a lot of his organs, bowels and intestines. It looked like it was a deadly situation. And he was talking about, this older preacher was telling me that, he said just a girl is what he called her. He said she was an MD, obviously, surgeon, but about 25 years old. He said she couldn't have even been out of medical school that long. She came and did this surgery, and it looked like, they called the family in. It looked like, for all intents and purposes, he was going to die. And as a last-ditch effort, they did this surgery, and he says she saved his life. She literally saved his life. We realize with a surgeon how critical that is. How much more so a preacher's job when it comes to eternal souls. I'm not trying to trivialize the work of a doctor, but at the same time, anytime we teach, we preach, elders, how much more so when you're dealing with immortal souls of men and women, how serious that job is. And you see all that seriousness here in Paul's speech. He says he's innocent of the blood. He preached the whole counsel of God. You preach error, and what happens? If a guy teaches error, at least somebody along the way is probably going to believe error, to obey error, and many times die in error. And so that blood would be on his hands as well if he's teaching error. So Paul talks, realizes the gravity of what he's doing. Verse 28 is a verse that we quote very often, talking about the responsibility of elders. There are three different words used here: presbyteros, three different Greek words. Presbyteros, we translate that in English. We sort of transliterate that to presbyter or elder, synonymous terms. They're all synonymous, but they refer to different, just like with the names of Christ and the names of God, as we've talked about throughout the Bible. They're not necessarily meant to be proper names, but they're descriptions. So it is with the names given to elders. Presbyteros, they're elders, and they're presbyters. Episkopos is another one. Bishop, overseer, the idea of seeing over things. And then, of course, poimen is what is often translated pastor or shepherd. They shepherd the flock. Paul knew the Ephesian church is going to come upon difficult times. If you fast forward to the book of Revelation chapter 2, verses 1 through 7, you'll see those difficult times came. The tragedy here is double. Number one, the tragedy is that difficult times and apostasy came to this church. But the double tragedy here is that it came from where? From within. And it seems that Paul says it's going to come from even within that very eldership. Men are going to speak perverse things to draw away disciples after them. And that was the motive, to draw away disciples to themselves, not to follow themselves, not Jesus Christ. Paul had worked with them for 3 years. Again, he goes back to what he's saying in verses 26 and 27. I haven't shunned to declare unto the whole council, I'm pure from the blood of all men. And that's kind of what he's saying here toward the end. I haven't coveted your gold, your silver, your clothing. Verse 33, in other words, I've not been among you trying to strike it rich, to use you for your stuff, for your things. He said, it's just been preaching in the interest of your souls. He said, you know these own hands have ministered to my necessities. I've shown you all things so that laboring you ought to support the weak, to remember the words of Jesus, more blessed to give than to receive. He continues to remind them he has done everything in his power to help them to walk the straight and narrow, as we say. Getting to verse 32, where he's kind of closing out his speech, he says, I commend you to God, to the word of his grace, which is able to build you up and to give you an inheritance among all them which are sanctified. I have a note in my notes. Elders need to know what the Bible teaches. They need to know some church history and departures from the faith. And they need to know how to defeat false teaching. All this is kind of wrapped up within the whole speech here to the Ephesian elders. Again, 33 through 35 reminds him he'd never been covetous or materialistic. He took care of his own needs. He was content with his situation. Again, not trying to get rich. He uses his actions to teach them a proper understanding of work, money, and possessions. Again, it's like 1 Corinthians 11:1. Be ye followers of me, even as I also am of Christ. He set an example for them. And, God forbid, I hope I'm at Bremen until I die, but should the time ever come when I have to leave, I hope that I can leave just like Paul left. This is the way to leave a congregation. He knows, he says, I'm not going to see your face anymore. But when he had spoken, verse 36, he kneeled down, he prayed with them all, and they all wept sore, and fell on Paul's neck and kissed him, sorrowing most of all for the words which he spake, that they should see his face no more. And they accompanied him unto the ship. If you ever have to leave a congregation, that's how to leave. Where everybody's squalling, and it's just sad, and that's the way to go. Not crying tears of joy because you're leaving, but crying tears of sadness. I still remember very well leaving Childersburg to come to Bremen. We were excited about beginning the new work, but oh man, it was painful. that last Wednesday night, Sunday fell on July 1st. I don't know if y'all remember that, but I remember very well. July 1st fell exactly on a Sunday that year, and so the Wednesday before, we were at Childersburg for the last service. And it was tough, to say the least. We all left squalling, and it was a mess. But that's the way to leave a congregation, where everybody's sad. You don't want to leave when people say, "See you later. Glad to see you go." But you know what? That happens sometimes, doesn't it? I mean, God forbid you go and mess up a congregation to the point, or cause so much trouble that they can't wait to get rid of you, or they have to say, look, you got to go. You're causing too much trouble. If it should ever happen where you have to leave, this is the best way to leave a congregation. It's sad, because they know they're not going to see him again, but it's also good because they had a great relationship. They had a great working relationship. I mean, this is how, I realize I'm not speaking to a group of preachers, but if I were talking to preachers, I would tell them, you need to do your work so that when you leave, the last time you talk to that eldership, they're weeping. I mean, they're falling on your neck, hugging you, because they're so sad that you're leaving. That's the way it ought to be for every gospel preacher, but also really for every member. All right, chapter 21. Paul's going to Jerusalem. Very interesting. Again, Paul seems to think that when he gets to Jerusalem, he's going to die there. He doesn't realize God's got plans for him. Paul's big plan, Paul's kind of end game was to go where? He wants to go to Rome. He's probably thinking at this point it's not real likely. God is going to take some events of man's choosing, and he's going to sprinkle in a lot of providence and maybe even some miraculous, well, definitely some miraculous along the way. And God's going to send Paul to Rome. And poor old Paul might have been thinking about how many tents he's going to have to build to afford the trip to Rome, or how much support he might have to raise from the brethren. God says, no, Paul, don't worry about it. This one's on the state. So Paul's going to go to Rome on the state's dime. He's not even going to have to spend a cent to go. Verses 1 through 16 is his trip to Jerusalem. Again, Luke is with him. You see we in this section. We're still in one of the we sections. If you recall, we said this is this section where Luke is with Paul. He's going to be with him all the way to Rome. Verse 4. Finding disciples, we tarried there 7 days, who said to Paul through the Spirit that he should not go up to Jerusalem. This is an interesting point because it sounds like a command. In fact, my mom, not terribly long ago, was asking me about this verse. They had talked about it in their ladies' class and kind of got into a discussion trying to figure out, well, it sounds like through the Spirit he says don't go. So if Paul goes and he's told through the Spirit don't go, isn't he sinning? It does seem like it's a command. However, I would add that there's no rebuke for his going, so it seems to be, in this case, more like a warning. I like what J.W. McGarvey says. This was in his original commentary on Acts. By the way, if you hear me say original commentary on Acts, J.W. McGarvey came back a few years later and wrote another commentary on the book of Acts. He kind of revised the original commentary, but he changed enough that it wasn't just a revision. And so it was republished and called the new commentary on Acts. So that's why you hear me sometimes say the original commentary on Acts, because they are two separate books. You can't just get a revision. It's actually a whole other book. But anyway, sometimes the new version is not always an improvement. I kind of like the original better. I think, Bob, you were the one that put me onto that original commentary, and I'm not knocking the new one. It's really good too, but sometimes I like the original commentary better. But this was in the original commentary on Acts. McGarvey says, quote, "The knowledge was supernatural. The advice was the result of their own judgment." That seems to be the case here. Verse 5, you have another grand farewell. We'd accomplished those days. We departed and went our way. They all brought us on our way with wives and children until we were out of the city. We kneeled down on the shore and prayed. And we had taken our leave one of another. We took ship and they returned home again. Another, no doubt, sad farewell. Paul again, doesn't seem to have a clue what exactly is going to happen when he gets there. But again, I think from verse 4, this is the brethren. They know bad things are going to happen in Jerusalem. That's been revealed to them by the Spirit. They're begging him, don't go. And Paul is going to say, well, as we get to it, he's going to say, I'm ready to die, if that's what it means. So now you got verses 8 and 9. You've got Philip. He's one of the 7 from Jerusalem, back in chapter 6. Philip, he's called here Philip the evangelist. They stay there with him. He has 4 daughters, virgins, which did prophesy. There's no evidence that his daughters taught publicly or in mixed company. Obviously, this passage is not going to contradict 1 Timothy 2:12. Philip, you recall, baptized the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8. And here he is in Caesarea. Verses 10 through 14, Agabus is going to warn Paul against going to Jerusalem. Again, this is an inspired warning. Here comes Agabus, grabs Paul's girdle there, verse 11, bound his own hands and feet, and said, "Thus saith the Holy Spirit, so shall the Jews at Jerusalem bind the man that owneth this girdle." and shall deliver him into the hands of the Gentiles. Again, if you're Paul at this point, this is probably further reinforcing your belief. Jerusalem is the end of the line for me if I go there. So when they hear that, verse 12, both we, this would include Luke, of course, and they of that place besought him not to go up to Jerusalem. Don't go, Paul. It's not worth it. Paul answers and says, what mean you to weep and to break mine heart? For I'm ready not to be bound only, but also to die at Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus. When he would not be persuaded, we ceased, saying, the will of the Lord be done. Again, if this were a command, I don't think you have people, some of whom here are inspired, going, well, the will of the Lord be done. I think you'd have them saying, look, Paul, this is not the will of the Lord. Don't go. God is saying don't go. But again, the knowledge is supernatural. The advice is not. The advice is just their own judgment. They're begging him not to go. And Paul says, look, I'm ready to go and die, if that's what it means. So he goes in verse 16, there went with us also certain of the disciples of Caesarea, and brought with them one Mnason of Cyprus. King James has an old disciple with whom we should lodge. You read that in the King James and it sounds like he's an old man. What that means is you have it in several other of the newer translations, early disciple. In other words, he's been a Christian a long time. Maybe he goes back to the day of Pentecost. We don't know. We're not told, but we know he's been a Christian for some time. Verses 17 through 26, Paul visits James and goes to the temple. This section is covering Paul going and visiting James and the brethren and going into the temple. This is the end of Paul's third missionary journey. It's going to end not with returning where he started, as he sometimes would do. It's going to end with him being imprisoned. Paul's visits to Jerusalem after, I'm just going to list these very quickly, and I know we just don't have time to get a lot of background on them, but there are several visits to Jerusalem in Paul's life as a Christian. After he goes into Arabia, after becoming a Christian, he stayed there for a while. Then he went into Jerusalem. That was Acts 9, 26 through 28, and Paul also mentions that in Galatians 1. In Acts 11, 27 through 30, Paul's going to visit Jerusalem with Barnabas. They're delivering funds for the brethren there. In Acts chapter 15, Paul's going to go up, being a team player, and make sure everybody's on the same page for that meeting of the minds, so to speak, and they want to get the Holy Spirit's input on this and make sure everybody's on the same page. Some people call it the Jerusalem Conference. I really don't like that title for it because it sounds like they're conferring to vote on something, and that obviously was not the case. There was a quick visit in Acts chapter 18, verses 21 and 22. Some people say this is a referral to the visit of chapter 21, but it seems like it's a different visit to me. Here is, right here in chapter 21, is visit number 5 or number 4, depending on the one in Acts chapter 18. Now in verse 17, when we were come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us how? Gladly. That's an interesting statement because Paul had been so worried about them accepting the gift. In fact, in Romans 15, he says in verse 31, pray that they're going to accept the gift. He was worried about this being rejected. Paul, he has some strained relationship with the Jews for obvious reasons, but even the Jewish Christians, he's worried about this. Maybe the prejudice, I don't know. So Paul reports on all that he's done, and then James begins to talk to him. He declared particularly what things God had wrought among the Gentiles by his ministry, verse 19. When they heard it, they glorified the Lord. And they said unto him, James is going to speak later, here it just says they, brother, you see how many thousands of Jews, a lot of other translations have myriads of Jews, that seems to be the better translation, there are which believe, and they are all zealous of the law. And they're informed of thee, Paul, that thou teachest all the Jews which are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, neither to walk after the customs. Well, brothers and sisters and friends, I submit to you, Paul was teaching them to forsake Moses. Now, he's not saying necessarily they don't need to circumcise their children or walk after some customs. Some things were optional. But did he teach them to forsake Moses? Yeah. Read Romans. Read Galatians. What is it therefore? Verse 22. The multitude must needs come together, for they will hear that you've come to Jerusalem, Paul. Do therefore this, that, and you may want to underline these next two words. What? Who? God said? We say. I think that's a key phrase in this whole account. This is not God's instruction. These are some people that are zealous, I submit to you, far overzealous for the law of Moses. I'm not trying to be overly critical of them, because we might have done the same thing in their shoes with that background. They had such a strong Jewish background. But don't miss that phrase. Do therefore this that we say to thee. We have 4 men which have which have a vow on them. Them take and purify thyself with them, and be at charges with them, that they may shave their heads, and all may know that those things whereof they were informed concerning thee are nothing. But that thou thyself also walkest orderly, and what? Keepest the law. Did Paul keep the law? Well, I think he did here. Did he teach people to keep the law? No. As touching the Gentiles which believe, we have written and concluded that they observe no such thing, save only that they keep themselves from things offered to idols, and from blood, and from strangled, and from fornication. Hey, look, the Gentiles, those Christians, we're not worried about this stuff with them. But Paul, you are a good Jewish boy. I mean, you've got to keep the law. So Paul takes the men, and the next day, purifying himself with them, entered into the temple to signify the accomplishment of the days of purification, and that an offering should be offered for every one of them. And yet I read somewhere in a book that the blood of bulls and of goats cannot take away sin. It's not even possible. That's in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 4, which I think there's pretty strong evidence was written by none other than Paul the Apostle. When the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews which were of Asia, when they saw him in the temple, stirred up all the people and laid hands on him, crying out, Men of Israel, help. This is the man that teaches all men everywhere against the people and the law in this place, and further brought Greeks into the temple and hath polluted this holy place. They supposed he took Trophimus, an Ephesian, into the temple. You get into some trouble sometimes, don't you, when you start supposing? They supposed, but they were wrong. He never took Trophimus into the temple. Let's go back to this thing with Paul, though. I will refer you to McGarvey, again, the original commentary on Acts. He's got some good comments on this. I'm still not sure I agree with him. You know, inspiration didn't keep people from sinning. Just because you were inspired didn't mean you couldn't sin. Did Peter ever sin? I mean, Peter was an ordained apostle of Jesus Christ. And yet 3 times in a very short period of time, he denied that he knew the man. And on another occasion in Galatians 2, Paul says, I withstood him to the face. Why, Paul? Because he was to be blamed. Inspiration didn't mean you couldn't sin. Sometimes you talk about this passage, and if you dare insinuate Paul even might have sinned, I've seen some brethren get their hackles up, and I mean, they're upset. As if Paul is some kind of God in the flesh and could not sin. Paul's just as susceptible to sin as anybody. He's human. I think this was James' advice, James and the others. I don't think this was inspired advice. I think that we say is a key phrase here. Yeah. 1 Corinthians 9. To the Jew he became a Jew. And here's, McGarvey takes a different position on this. McGarvey takes a position that he did not sin. This is one of those, it doesn't matter if he did, if he didn't. It's not going to affect our salvation one way or the other. Doesn't affect anything today. McGarvey takes a position, as I read quickly because McGarvey had a lot to say about this, but if I read that right, reading over it pretty quickly, he was taking the position that he did not sin. Some people say this isn't an endorsement of keeping the law of Moses, but maybe just building a relationship with the Jews. Kind of like what Bob was saying, 1 Corinthians 9, to the Jews I became as a Jew. I don't think in this instance that is adequate to explain the situation. That you have an animal sacrifice involved here. I mean, again, hindsight's 20/20. It's easy for us to sit here and go, Paul, what are you doing? But in that situation with the Jewish background and the Jews saying, hey, look, come on, man. People are going to think. And Paul's trying so hard to reach his Jewish brethren because on another occasion in the book of Romans, he says what? I could wish myself accursed from Christ if it would help save my brethren, the Jews, my kinsmen according to the flesh. He's trying so hard. Is it possible, folks, that you try so hard you go too far? It certainly is. Now, again, I don't know if that's what happened here. Some say, and then this is not going to hold water. There are some arguments that might work, might not. Some people say, and this doesn't hold water, well, Paul held to the law of Moses until he wrote Romans and Galatians. Well, there's a problem with that. Number one, Paul says he's not learning this as he goes. He's getting it by inspiration. Galatians chapter 1. Number two problem with that is Galatians and Romans have already been written at this point. So that's not going to work. The vow here seems like maybe it's a Nazirite vow, but again, the major problem here is the animal sacrifice going completely against Hebrews 10:4. It may very well be that Paul he just flat out went too far and he sinned. It certainly would be possible. Paul purified himself with the men. He obeyed these Old Testament laws. Again, I don't know how I could justify this when I put it together with other New Testament passages. I just don't know how. He's being asked to do this as a test. It's like a test of faithfulness. This is not just, hey, look, Paul, you know the law of Moses is nothing. We know the law of Moses is nothing. It's been nailed to the cross, but, come on, just go along to get along in this sense, and we know it's not any kind. He's being asked to do this as a test. Look, Paul, you need to show everybody you're a faithful Jewish boy. Keep the law. Again, I don't know how I can justify that. Brother Mosier, I was noticing, it's funny, I'm going to say this because Brother Mosier used to get angry because sometimes people would tend to misquote him, and he would often say, "Don't quote me from your notes." Well, Brother Mosier, if you're out there and watching, sorry. But Brother Mosier says in his class that I had him for Acts in preacher school, he says, this is compromising the gospel. And I tend to agree with that. I've taken both positions over the years, but studying it's just hard for me to come up with any other conclusion. Some things it's okay to do so as not to offend, but when it becomes a test, here's if nothing else, here's what we learn from this. When it becomes a test, don't do it. If it's something like that. Bottom line here, God is using all this providentially to get Paul where? To Rome. He's going to Rome. Paul, every indication seems to think he's going to die in Jerusalem. Jesus says, you're going to Rome. You wanted to go. Careful what you ask for, right? You just might get it. He's going to Rome as a prisoner. But anyways, again, I have a hard time. I can't find a way to justify it, but if it may very well be that he didn't. It may very well be that he did this in such a way. Again, if I wanted to argue the other side of it, I'd say there's no rebuke here. There's no rebuke given. When Peter sinned, Paul says, I withstood him to the face. There's no rebuke of Paul here given whatsoever. That doesn't necessarily mean he didn't sin or go too far, but it is interesting. One of those things, it doesn't matter one way or the other for us, but boy, when this time studying it and trying to think about it, I can't come up with any way where you just say this is okay. You mean, especially when you read Galatians and you read Romans, and especially if Paul wrote the book of Hebrews, and I believe he did. Wow. But you know what? End of the day, Paul was a human. And just like any human, there are times he made mistakes. This may or may not have been one of those, but I know he did make mistakes because he was human. Verses 27 through 36. Paul's arrested in the temple. Again, we got into this just a little bit reading a moment ago. These are troublemakers, of course. They're stirring up the crowd. They make this false charge against Paul. He's taking Greeks into the temple. He's defiling the temple. They're so worried about defiling the temple. You remember when Jesus was crucified? Oh, go break their legs. Get them off the cross. The Sabbath day is approaching. You can't defile our Sabbath day. Get them dead already. I want to go break the legs. Oh, because we don't want to be ceremonially unclean on the Sabbath. You just killed your Messiah. That's the least of your concerns. Many times they were so worried about defiling the temple or defiling this day or that day. Verse 29, again, that key word is supposed. Paul did not bring Trophimus into the temple. They supposed it. I'm going to skip a little bit. Verse 30. All the city was moved. The people ran together. They took Paul, drew him out of the temple, and forthwith the doors were shut. Why'd they shut the doors? Well, you typically shut a door to keep somebody out. Who do they want out? The Romans. They want to have their way with Paul. They don't want the Romans coming in and messing with that. This is the kind of nonsense with the Jews that is going to reach a fever pitch. And eventually Rome is going to say, enough. And they're going to march on Rome, not on Rome, on Jerusalem, and they are going to obliterate that city in AD 70. But this is the kind of stuff that leads to it. Oh, shut the temple doors. The soldiers can't get in. Now, that's not going to keep them out, of course. We see the soldiers come in, verses 31 through 36. They break up the mob. They arrest Paul. Well, he must have done something wrong. There's all this trouble about him. So they arrest him. Of course, Rome doesn't tolerate mob violence of any kind. We've already talked about that in a previous setting where they got kind of a mob thing going on. So they take him, they arrest him, and they want to find out what he's done. They bind him with 2 chains, verse 33, demanded who he was, what he had done. Some cried one thing, some another. They don't know what's going on. Again, this mob mentality. So they say, carry him into the castle. And then when he's being carried up on the steps there, he asked to speak to the crowd. He asked the chief captain, I think the ESV and other versions have tribune, same office, just different names. Verse 37, and he says, by the way, we find out in Acts chapter 23, verse 26, that his name is Claudius Lysias. So he wants him brought back to the barracks or the praetorium. On the way, he asks, can I speak to you? So the tribune says, oh, you can speak Greek? It seems he was speaking in Latin. Now he speaks in Greek to the tribune. I don't know, maybe he recognized him as a Greek person. It doesn't really tell us, but it seems he switched languages because the guy's surprised. He says, oh, you can speak Greek? And then what's going to happen at the end of the chapter? He's going to turn around and speak Hebrew. You think this fellow's not pretty sharp? Paul was a very educated man. This is the beginning of a long time of imprisonment for Paul. Verses 37 through 40, he begins to address the people. And of course, he's going to speak in Hebrew. Paul is mistaken, by the way, by Claudius Lysias for a recent Egyptian revolutionary that the Romans had dealt with. Brother Moser says that Egyptian historically pretended to be a prophet, led an army of 4,000 followers into Jerusalem. The army of Felix defeated the group, but the Egyptian escaped. So it seems Claudius Lysias is going, oh, okay, you're that guy. Paul says, no, I'm not him. So he begins speaking to them in Hebrew. The Jews would understand this, obviously. The Romans may or may not understand it. Some of them, no doubt, were educated and knew the language from working in Jerusalem, probably, but perhaps not. Brother Moser also mentioned to us that on the stairs, Paul was on the stairs speaking to the Jews below, and this meant they were in what court of the temple? Just think of the irony here. They're worried about defiling the temple. Where are they standing? The Gentile court. Oh, they're worried about defilement when it suits them. But when it's not convenient, they're not really worried about it, are they? They're angry about Paul supposedly defiling the temple, but they're defiling themselves being there in the Gentile court. Now, chapter 22. The first 21 verses of 22 is continuing this address to the crowd. He's going to recount his conversion, and of course, at some point, they're going to stop listening because he actually mentions the word Gentiles. They just hated, by and large, not every Jew, but by and large, they were so prejudiced toward the Gentiles. He addresses them as brethren. This will be brethren according to the flesh. This is how a Jewish person would refer to another Jew. You'll see this with Ananias when he comes to Saul as well, back when he was Saul. He tells them why he's a Christian. He's going to offer a defense. What's the Greek word? Apologia. We get our English word apology, not an I'm sorry type apology, but a defense. It means to give a defense. Again, you might want to add a reference here to 1 Peter 3:15. Be ready always to give a defense. Paul's ready, and he's going to give a defense why he's a Christian. The crowd hears him speaking in Hebrew, and they listen up. That got their attention for now. Paul had been in Jerusalem quite a bit in his earlier years. He studied at the school of Gamaliel. the best-known Jewish school in the day. Gamaliel was a grandson of Hillel, one of the famous schools among the Jews. Paul apparently, based on verse 4, had killed more Christians than just Stephen, or at least been involved in it. You couldn't find a more vicious opponent of Christianity in the early years than Saul. He says the high priest and the elders, they could bear witness to how vehemently he opposed Christianity. Verse 5, Damascus was quite a long way from Jerusalem to go there just to arrest Christians. But that's how zealous Paul was. Saul at the time, of course. Verses 6 through 16, he's going to recount his conversion. Listen, folks, this is great evidence of the resurrection. Paul basically, as a Jew, he had it all. And he completely turns his back and he makes a complete 180 and goes the other way. Why does a man do that? I'm not saying that's the only evidence by itself, but it is part of the evidence for the resurrection. Why does a man do that? He gladly turns away. He says in Philippians, I count it all as dung, waste, refuse. Why? Because he, Jesus, lives. The tomb is empty. He says he was blinded. It's interesting, his mind and his figurative eyes were open, for a time at least, but his physical eyes were closed here as he saw the Lord on the road to Damascus. Verse 9, he says, let me get the exact wording here. They that were with me saw indeed the light and were afraid, but they heard not the voice of him that spake to me. It's not a contradiction with Acts 9:7. Sometimes people say it's a contradiction because Acts 9:7 says they heard the voice. It's kind of like when your wife says something to you and she says, did you hear me? And you say, uh-huh. And she says, what'd I say? Yeah, it was something about what I need to be doing, right? No, well, tell me what I said. Well, I don't know. I heard you, but I didn't hear you. Well, we do that sometimes, right? So probably what happened here is they heard a noise, but they didn't understand it. They may have heard Paul talking, by the way. They may not hear the voice of Jesus, but they hear Paul's side. It's kind of like somebody's on the phone, and you're hearing their side. Did you hear my conversation I had with so-and-so? Yeah. Well, I didn't hear the other side of it. That might be what it was. We learn from Acts chapter 26 when he recounts his conversion to Agrippa that the voice spoke to him in what language? Hebrew. It may be that the men traveling with him didn't speak Hebrew. So maybe it just sounds like gibberish to them because they don't understand the language. There are all kind of answers here, but there is no contradiction. By the way, Apologetics Press has a good article on that on their website, why it's not a contradiction. Verse 10 is the response of faith. Lord, what would you have me to do? That's the natural response of faith. What shall I do, Lord? Paul doesn't recount the days that he spent in prayer at the house for 3 days. He talks about that in Acts 9 through 11. Ananias comes to him in verse 13, calls him brother Saul. Again, this is how a Jewish person would refer, brethren would refer to one another, brother in the flesh. He says, again, we've pointed out before, this is the only time in the Bible you have an alien sinner on his knees praying, and he's told, you need to arise. Arise, and why are you waiting? In other words, why tarriest thou? Arise and be baptized and wash away thy sins, calling on the name of the Lord. I've mentioned before, put you a note in your Bible, Romans 10:13, Acts 2:21, those verses where it says, whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord shall be saved. Part of calling on the name of the Lord is being baptized into Christ to have your sins washed away. These verses are connected. Don't lose sight of that. So he's told to arise and be baptized. He does. Verse 17, Paul skips over the time he spent in Arabia and Damascus, which would be a period of about 3 years. He does mention that in Galatians 1. Verse 18, him. I saw him saying unto me. You probably got this in red if you have the words of Jesus are in red. It doesn't really say who him is here, but it's pretty clear from the context. This is Jesus. And then verse 21, he really gets their blood boiling because he says, he has Jesus saying to him, depart, for I will send thee far hence unto the Gentiles. They gave him audience unto this word and then lifted up their voices and they say, get rid of this guy. He's not fit that he should live. Old prejudices die hard, don't they? Paul's making the point that Jesus sent him specifically to the Gentiles. They didn't like that one bit. Verses 22 through 29, Lord willing, next week we'll look at Paul talking there to the tribune, or the King James has the chief captain. And we'll see Paul before the council, going to the end of the beginning in the last verse and going on into chapter 23. And then we'll see him begin his journey to Rome. I wanted to have some time at the end of class for any questions or comments. If you had some, do me a favor, write those down. I know we're completely out of time now, but we'll do our best to get to those. I'm having to just hustle. I love the questions, I love the discussion, but I want to hustle and get through all the text before we run out of time. We've got next week, and one more. So I think if we hustle up, we can make it. But hang on to those questions or comments, and we'll try to get to those next week, Lord willing. Thank you very much.